All right. Good morning. Good morning. We've invited Austen Hartke here as part of our education and becoming an even more welcoming and inclusive church in the RIC process. Austen Hartke is the author of Transforming the Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians, a book on theology and personal narratives. The book can be found here. If you would like a copy afterwards, please see Austen for details. He is also the founder and executive director of Transmission Ministry Collective, an online community dedicated to the spiritual care, faith formation, and leadership potential of transgender and gender-expansive Christians. Austen is a graduate of Luther Seminary's Master of Arts program in Old Testament and Hebrew Bible Studies, and the winner of the 2014 John Milton Prize in Old Testament writing from Luther. Please welcome.
Thank you. Up here. Thank you so much. I think we maybe have the online mic, but not the mic in the room. Should I just talk loud? Okay. Okay, I'll talk loud. I'll hold this out here so I'm not deafening the people online. Well, thank you so much for having me, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so happy that the RIC Council invited me. Louder? Okay, I'll try to talk as loud as possible. I will do my best. I'm here today to talk to you about gender diversity in Scripture. And so this is something that I have worked on, research that I've worked on for many years now. Information that I talk to a lot of different churches about. A lot of churches want to know, how do we talk about gender diversity and the Bible, especially as we're talking about transgender or gender expansive people today in our churches. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And if you're like, what are we even talking about when we talk about gender diversity and what are these words he's using, I'm going to give you a couple of short definitions before we actually get into the Bible. So let's take a look at what we have here. What is gender diversity? So there are many different ways to understand how gender works. And if you are a sociologist, you're going to have one version of how gender works. If you're a biologist, you're going to have one version of how gender works. If you're an anthropologist, you're going to have a different understanding of how gender works across cultures, right? So there are many different models for how to understand gender. This is one model that is adapted from an organization called Gender Spectrum out in San Francisco. It does a lot of education on this kind of thing. So this model I found to be very helpful. A model that thinks about gender in three different facets that all interact and affect each other. So the first facet is our bodies, right? I think that's what most people think about when we think about gender. We think about our bodies. So we have things in our bodies that we often gender. So our internal and external reproductive organs, our chromosomes, our hormone levels, and our brain matter, all those things that have to do with our bodies. And most of the time, you'll notice in our little stick figure over here, I've got body pointing just specifically to one part of this little stick figure's body, because most of the time when we talk about gender and our bodies, all people are concerned with is our external reproductive organs. And that's kind of where we stop thinking about it. But there's a lot more going on in our bodies in terms of chromosomes, hormone levels, and again, brain matter. So there's a lot more happening with our bodies and with gender than most people think. So that's one section of gender. A second part of our gender is our gender identity. And this is our internal self-perception and experience of being female, male, both, or neither. So this is how we understand ourselves internally. Gender identity is not something that people can see when they look at us. That's how we understand ourselves, right? So most people, when they want to talk about somebody's gender, somebody else's gender, they look at their bodies and they can't really see what's going on with somebody's gender identity. The third section is your gender expression, and this is how we make our gender visible to others. So it's the way you show your gender to others through clothing, hair, mannerisms, voice, etc., which have gendered values in your particular society, so in your time and place. So again, we can't see somebody else's gender identity, but we make guesses about somebody else based on what their gender expression looks like and what we think we know about their bodies. That's how we kind of figure out how other people's gender works. So if you are a transgender person, what that means, like a very broad definition of the word transgender, is that you have a gender identity which is different from the sex that you were assigned at birth based on your body. So when you're born, the doctors usually say, congratulations, it's a boy or it's a girl, right? That's the moment when you get your sort of assigned sex or assigned gender, this idea of here's what we think this person is based on their body. And then later on, if the person's like, actually, my gender identity doesn't match that, that person might identify as transgender. So that's sort of a broad definition of what that word means. This is what I just said. I got ahead of myself. We're talking about assigned sex here. The other complicating factor here is that while most people are endosex, meaning that they have sex characteristics that can be easily assigned as male or female, about 1.7% of our population is intersex, meaning they have differences in sex development. So even at the level of just our bodies, it's not as easy as we often think to categorize all people into just men or just women, because intersex people may have sex characteristics that are not easily distinguishable between what we would think of as male or female. So even on the level of our bodies, there's complexity. On the level of our identities, there's complexity. And then, of course, in terms of gender expression, there's complexity, because what a man looks like in the US is different from how a man would express gender in Saudi Arabia or Malaysia, right? So there's layers of complexity in all three of these factors: body, gender identity, and gender expression. So when we're talking about the Bible today, one thing that's important to keep in mind is that we usually can't say anything definitive about the gender identity of people in the Bible, because again, that's something we can't see, right? So unless a character in the Bible says, I'm a man, we don't know how they internally understand themselves. So we're looking at reports related to bodies and gender expression, the two things that are more visible to the outside observer, to try to understand how gender works in the Bible. Second, it's important to remember that the identity categories we use today don't map easily onto the past. So we can't sort of claim people for one specific identity. So I'm never going to go into the Bible and go, that person is transgender, because our understanding of what that word means is not what it would have meant to them, if anything, right? And our cultural differences are so wide at this point because of time and space that it just wouldn't make sense. So we can look back and we can go, something is different about this person's gender, something's going on there, but we don't want to use our modern words today and just sort of slap them on people in the past and assume that that's accurate. Does that make sense? Cool. All right, let's talk about some Bible stories. The first Bible story that I think most people think of when they think about gender in the Bible is Genesis 1, the creation of human beings, right? God made them male and female. So let's take a look at this passage. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over all the cattle and all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and the birds of the air, and every living thing that moves upon the earth. So lots of times when people look at this passage, and specifically that verse in blue, folks will look at that and read that very literally and say, well, if God created only men and women, then that's all that can exist. That's all that God means for there to be. That's all that should exist. That's all that can exist, right? And that's a very literalist interpretation of this text. So what I want to do is have us think about how this text functions, right? When God is creating in Genesis, what's the first thing God creates? Does anybody remember? Light. God says, let there be light, and let's separate the light from the darkness, right? Does anybody remember what God separated and created the second day? Land and sea, exactly. So in land and sea, God creates the waters. God says, like, let the waters above the earth be separated from the waters below the earth, right? And then the land and the sea. So God is taking the chaos of creation and dividing it up usually into pairs. So light, dark, land, sea, fish, birds, right? There's all of these pairs that show up throughout Genesis 1. And part of the reason that's so evocative for us is because Genesis 1 reads like a poem, right? It's got a refrain. It's got, and there was morning and evening the first day. God said it was good, right? So it's got a refrain, much like a poem or a song. And it's got these verses where it's God creates X and Y, and it was good in the next day, right? So Genesis 1 is much more of a poem than it is a biology textbook, right? If Genesis 1 was going to actually try to include everything that exists, we would have a biology textbook, right? We would have some kind of larger taxonomic structure. There's a reason that penguins do not show up in Genesis 1, and it's not because they're evil, it's because they didn't live there, right? But had they lived there at the time, it might have been difficult for the people reading Genesis 1 to go, now hang on, a penguin is a bird, but it swims in the sea like a fish. Where do we put a penguin in our sort of larger structure of Genesis 1, right? So there are things that don't quite work. So right. Right. Yeah. So exactly. In especially the creation narratives and in a lot of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, when it talks about the world, that essentially just meant the place where the people lived. It didn't mean the globe because we didn't know a globe existed back then, right? So at this point, people were still like, no, it's light and dark at the same time everywhere because they thought the earth was flat, right? It wasn't until we figured out the earth was round that we realized that that was a light situation, right? So when we think about these sort of contexts, when it says God created light and dark, how do we deal with the fact that there is dawn and dusk? There are these places in between. This is a time-lapse photo. I think it's of a pier in California, but you have to check me on that. But you get this sense of there's a movement between light and dark that happens. And when Genesis 1 says there's light and there's dark, we look at it and we think, okay, sure, there's light and there's dark, and there's all this stuff in between, right? And that to us totally makes sense. But when we start to think about gender, we go, well, no, that must be two boxes. It must not be a spectrum like this. It must be two boxes. Realistically, that's not how the world works, right? So this is it's a small graph, so you might not be able to see it very well. This is average height, right? Average height for men and women. This is average height for men with the blue line, average height for women with the pink line. And what we see is that there is a huge overlap in terms of average height, right? And it kind of goes off at the ends. This is what we call a double bell curve. Basically, there are points at which we can look at two groups of things and figure out what the overlap is. And with characteristics like height, for instance, there's a obvious overlap where we go, okay, there's a middle space. It's not just men are tall and women are short. And we all know that. We live in Minnesota. We have a lot of tall women here, right? So we know that even though we like to think that men are always taller than women, we know that's not true cognitively, right? Almost every physical characteristic that we think men have this and women have that is almost always a double bell curve. So this movement between what we expect in terms of gender, even on a physical level, like not to say anything of social characteristics, right? There's almost always an in-between, just as there is with night and day. So it's kind of unfair of us to read men and women as two discrete boxes when everything else in Genesis 1 exists as a spectrum, right? Land and sea, you've got marshes and estuaries and beaches and coral reefs, all these things that exist in between, right? So we want to think carefully about how we understand Genesis 1. If we're going to read it literally, then we have to read every category literally, not just the categories that make our argument for us, right? So this is a passage from a book called Torah Queries. This is from a Jewish tradition where they're talking about this text. Zakar unekeva is the Hebrew for men and women, right? So they say Zakar unekeva, men and women, is, I believe, a merism, a common biblical figure of speech in which a whole is alluded to by some of its parts. When the biblical text says there was evening and there was morning the first day, it means, of course, that there was dawn, morning, noon, afternoon, and there was dusk. Evening and morning are used to encompass all the times of day. Read not, therefore, God created even every human being as either male or female, but rather God created humankind, Zakaru Nekeva, male and female, and every combination in between. So even when we look at a text that seems like it's the most clear cut, there's a lot of interesting things going on behind the scenes. So let's hold on to that. We're going to talk about another passage here. When we talk about gender expression, remember, this is what people can see, right? This is how we culturally express our gender. So in Deuteronomy 22:5, this is probably the second most common verse that's sort of like used against transgender people. The second verse says, "A woman shall not wear a man's apparel, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment, for whoever does such things is abhorrent to the Lord your God," right? So this passage is often used against transgender folks today. And this is a passage that we could either get into it the same way that we got into it with Genesis 1, because there's a lot happening even in something that seems as clear as this. For instance, what is a man's garment and what is a woman's garment? Because the context of where they were living in their time and place is much different than for us today. So if we were going to try to read this literally and read it onto our context, within the context of global Christianity, how we dress and what men's and women's clothing looks like is very different, right? So if we're within the context of global Christianity and we say, well, men can't wear dresses or men can't wear skirts, right? How do we explain kilts, right? Like, how do we explain a cultural difference like that? So there are things that we can get into even in terms of like how this Bible verse is not so much what it was originally intended, but how we would apply it today. The application is really complicated. But even if we were going to read this, say, just strictly as it is, right? Men's and women's clothing have to be different. Let's say we're just going to read it straight off like that. If we were, we have to ask the question, why was this verse written? What was the point of this verse? Why were the ancient Israelites concerned with this? Was this a problem? Part of what we think was going on there is that there were categories within Israelite society that were sort of structured in a specific way to make everything work easily. And so this is maybe part of that structuring of trying to put everything into kind of one box or another. That could be part of it. But we've got a couple of other guesses for why this is happening. So some of you might know Thomas Aquinas. I know this text is very small. Please forgive me. Thomas Aquinas is one of the sort of like church fathers or church patriarchs. He wrote the Summa Theologica, which is a really intentional and important document, especially within Catholic theology. So Thomas Aquinas said this about this passage: outward apparel should be consistent with the estate of the person, meaning their gender, according to the general custom. So even Thomas Aquinas is like, according to the general custom, okay, so it's going to be different in different times and places. Even Thomas Aquinas recognizes that. Hence, it is in itself sinful for a woman to wear man's clothes or vice versa, especially because this may be the cause of sensuous pleasure. We hate it when people have fun. It's expressly forbidden in the law in Deuteronomy 22 because Gentiles used to practice this change of attire for the purpose of idolatrous superstition. So Thomas Aquinas thinks this verse was written because, and this is backed up by historical fact, people who lived around the people of Israel back in Old Testament times did allow for more gender diversity in their dress in the worship of other gods. So it's possible that this verse was written because people were worried about kind of a slippery slope argument. Like, don't start dressing like those people because then you'll start worshiping their gods. Or don't start dressing like they do when they worship their gods because other people might mistake you for worshipers of that god, right? So that might be why this verse was written. But I want to draw your attention to this last sentence. Nevertheless, this may be done sometimes without sin on account of some necessity, either in order to hide oneself from enemies or through lack of other clothes or some similar motive. So even Thomas Aquinas is like, all right, but we're going to have loopholes for this. Interestingly, Thomas Aquinas's theology here, this point on Deuteronomy 22 was used as part of the defense of Joan of Arc. If you remember the story of Joan of Arc, She was captured by the English, fought in the English and French War, French and English War. I think it matters which way you say it. And she was captured, and she was eventually put to death, really as a political prisoner. But the reasoning they gave was because she dressed in man's clothes, and so she was burnt for heresy because of that. So even Thomas Aquinas was like, okay, but there might be loopholes, and they tried to use this in Joan's defense, and they wanted to burn her so bad it didn't matter, unfortunately. But there's an acknowledgement throughout Christian history that, like, there are other reasons that this might happen, right? One more possible reason for why this verse was written. This is from a Jewish commentator named Abraham ibn Ezra. He says this passage deals with the passage dealing with the attire of a man is juxtaposed with the passages dealing with going out to war, because woman was created to rear children, and if she were instead to go out among the men to war, she would eventually become involved in debauchery. Again, we hate it when people have fun. So this commentator thinks that the reason that Deuteronomy 22:5, the verse we were talking about with clothes, it was close to passages about war. And so, and there's some good theological reasons for thinking that the words for men's and women's clothing in that passage may have been related to war clothing more than everyday clothing, right? So that's what this commentator thinks, is that it was really about war stuff and keeping women out of war than it was anything else. So if we've got these two sort of things here, right? Like, you're not supposed to do this, and also maybe it was about war, we're going to look at two other stories that kind of get a little bit in the face of these interpretations. The first one, as we're talking about war, is the story of Deborah. And you might remember Deborah, you might not. We don't talk about her enough. She's amazing. She's in the book of Judges. She was the only female judge of Israel, and a judge was somebody who both led the community, but was also a military leader. That was part of what a judge did. And interestingly, Deborah, because the Bible leader or the Bible writers were a little bit concerned about how Deborah would be seen, she is never called a judge of Israel. She is called the woman who judges Israel, because they were like, we can't say she's a judge for sure, because that's being a military leader too, and we're nervous about that. But Deborah did all the things that other judges did, right? So there's a story where Deborah is freeing the Israelites from oppression under another group of people. And Deborah picks out this guy, Barak. She's like, you're going to be my general, right? So Deborah and Barak are going to figure out how to free the people. And Barak is a little nervous about this. Barak says, if you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. She said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera, the enemy general, into the hand of a woman. And then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh, and Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 warriors went up behind him, and Deborah went up with him. The reason that I've got all of this in blue is because the number of times that we are told that Deborah goes to the battlefield with Barak is wild. They really want us to know Deborah's going to the battlefield, which was not something that women were supposed to do, right? So Deborah is a great example of, like, if that verse about clothing was concerned with women going to war, Deborah kind of flies in the face of that and is doing something that should not have been done. And yet she is only seen in a positive light throughout her entire story. She is seen as a military leader. She is called a mother in Israel. Nothing about the way that she judges Israel is seen as negative, despite the fact that this seems to be going against what Deuteronomy is saying. So we've got Deborah. Another classic story is Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, right? Joseph is almost the second to youngest of Israel, who is also aka Jacob. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob is also Israel, same guy. So his second to youngest son, Joseph, Israel loves Joseph more than any of his other children because he's the son of his old age, and he makes Joseph a long robe with sleeves in the NRSV. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. So we remember what happens to Joseph. He gets beat up and sold into slavery in Egypt, right? And then eventually saves his whole family. So there's some interesting stuff happening with Joseph. You'll see here in the blue, a long robe with sleeves is how Joseph's garment is translated in the NRSV. In other translations, so you can, this is one of those funny things where you could like line up a bunch of different translations and see the differences. The Hebrew is ketonet pasim. So that's the Hebrew, ketonet pasim. The reason that it's translated so differently across different English versions is because we straight up don't know what ketonet pasim means. We're making educated guesses, and that's why it's so different across different translations. A ketonet, we know what that is. That's a robe. So that's where we get like robe or coat of many colors. We know ketonet is a robe. A ketonet pasim is, we don't know. It's something different. And so what Bible scholars do when they're looking through, Hebrew or looking through Greek or looking through Aramaic or whatever, and they come across something that they don't understand, they look for other places in the Bible where that thing shows up so they can kind of cross-reference it and go, well, what is it over here? Then maybe that's what it is over here too, right? That's usually how they figure it out. Ketonet pasim is only used in 2 places in the whole Bible. So Joseph and then one other story. And the other story is the story of King David's daughter Tamar. Tamar was wearing a ketonet pasim, for this is how the virgin daughters of the king were clothed in earlier times. So the only other time we hear about a ketonet pasim is when it's a princess dress. Why is Joseph wearing a princess dress? There's something going on with the way Joseph expresses his gender. And even outside of just this little bit of text, there are other places throughout Joseph's story where he does things outside of what men are supposed to do, according to the time and place, right? Joseph's gender seems to be a little bit wibbly. But when we're talking specifically about clothing, this is the moment where we go, Joseph's dressing differently than his brothers. And the fact that his brothers all hate him is something that when we read this story together, for instance, with LGBTQ plus people today, most of them understand how it feels to be bullied for looking different. This is a passage that often really resonates with LGBTQ plus people when we read it. So this sort of moment for Joseph is one where we can say, okay, we don't know exactly what's happening with Joseph, but we know that something in what he's doing and what he's wearing is different than what is expected, and would theoretically go against that verse about not dressing in men's or women's clothes, right? Like this would go against that. And yet Joseph is another person who throughout his whole story is seen only as seen positively the whole time. So neither, you would think that if we have 2 people that are going against this idea of what people are supposed to wear, that they would be used as sort of like morality tales, right? Like, and they did this bad thing and then terrible stuff happened to them and they were terrible people. Neither of those things are happening with either Deborah or Joseph. So let's talk about one other category here. We've talked a little bit about Genesis and the creation of gender. We've talked about gender expression. We're going to now talk about changing bodies and what happens when we change things with our bodies. So another Deuteronomy verse here. This is Deuteronomy 23:1. And this is one, I memorized a lot of Bible verses when I was a kid. This is one they never made me memorize for some reason. This Bible verse says, no one whose testicles are crushed or whose penis is cut off should be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. A cheery little verse. This verse is an interesting one. It comes right at the beginning of Deuteronomy 23, chapter 23. All the verses after this are about other people that are excluded from the assembly of the Lord. So it's like, if you do this or that, or if you're this type of person, or you come from this particular, group of people, you can't be in the assembly of the Lord. So that's what this context of this chapter is. So we have to ask some questions about what's going on here, right? Why this is happening, where it's coming from. One thing, though, that I will mention before we move on just from this verse is that one of the principal categories of people who is excluded in Deuteronomy 23:1 are the Moabites. If you are a Moabite, you are excluded from the assembly of the Lord forever and ever and ever, no loopholes. And yet, does anybody remember the story of Ruth? Ruth was a Moabite. Ruth joined the people of Israel with her mother-in-law Naomi, and then married Boaz, who was one of the great grandfathers of King David. If Ruth had not been allowed into the community of Israel against this rule, against the rules in Deuteronomy 23, we would not have King David and we would not have Jesus. So explicit going against who was allowed in Deuteronomy 23 is part of our story. And that's just an interesting thing to keep in mind. So with this particular one, no changing of external reproductive organs, we have to ask some questions about this. When we're looking at people in the Bible who have these changes in external reproductive organs, they're often called saris in Hebrew. A saris we translate usually as eunuch, but it can also be translated as official or chamberlain or cupbearer. So if you're, especially in the King James Version, it was often translated as cupbearer. So if you're like, oh yeah, I remember some cupbearers in the Bible, that's who we're talking about here. The reason that saris was used for both a eunuch, a person who was castrated, and for an official or a chamberlain or a cupbearer is because those people were so often eunuchs that it ended up becoming the same word. In the same way that most people don't say facial tissue, they say Kleenex, because we've just associated that word with both things. That's the same thing that's going on with the word saris in the Hebrew Bible. So saris, they show up everywhere in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we have the word eunuchos, which is where we get our word eunuch. And eunuchs show up just a couple of times, 8 times in the New Testament. But these are people usually who are assigned male at birth who are castrated. And as far as we know, they were treated as separate from the gender binary, from this idea of like men and women. They were a third thing in Babylon, Persia, and Egypt. So even though there was sort of strict understandings about what men could do and what women could do, eunuchs had like their own rules. They were seen as a third thing, not men, not women. They were something else. And so usually, again, it was for people who were assigned male at birth who were castrated, but sometimes, as far as we can tell historically and documenting kind of the both in the Bible and sort of extra biblical evidence that we have from the ancient Near East, it also covered people who were intersex. So we talked about intersex people earlier, people born with differences in sex development. Often they would just be lumped into this category of eunuch because they were seen as not men and not women. They were a third thing. So saris could be intersex people. It could be people who were male and castrated, right? But they had their own set of rules. So we have that rule, Deuteronomy 23:1, about no eunuchs admitted into the assembly of the Lord. There's a huge arc through scripture of what happens with eunuchs. And we're only going to go to the very end because we don't have time for the whole arc. But if you want to figure out the whole arc here that goes from Deuteronomy to Isaiah to Matthew to Acts and onward into the church, there's a lot there to read and it's very cool. And it's in my book. So we're going to just skip to the end. But the last thing before we skip to the end of the story in Acts is I want to say something about this assembly of the Lord. What does the assembly of the Lord mean? Some people think it meant the whole community of Israel. You couldn't be part of the whole community. Other people think that it was specifically you could not marry into the community of Israel. So like you could join, but you couldn't marry an Israelite. Maybe that was it. Or maybe it was about worship in the temple. Maybe it was you were allowed to be part of the community, but you couldn't worship in the temple with everybody else. So it's sort of like layers of glass ceilings, like which one was it that people were allowed to do? We're not totally sure. It could be any of those things. But what we know is there were restrictions on people who were castrated, on eunuchs. So we're going to move all the way into the New Testament, all the way to Acts chapter 8. If you remember the story of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8, this is a person who was traveling all the way from Ethiopia, all the way to Israel, all the way to Jerusalem to worship in the temple. And we don't know what happened when this person went all the way to Jerusalem to worship, but likely, based on all evidence that we have, the person would not have been allowed to worship in the temple because that was sort of like it was at least that, right? It was at least you couldn't worship in the temple. It may have been you couldn't be part of the community at all, but we know at least it was that you couldn't worship in the temple. So this person would have traveled thousands of miles from Ethiopia to Jerusalem to worship in the temple and almost certainly would not have been allowed in. So we've got this story. There was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. He'd come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home. So we don't know what happened when he got there, but we know he's now on his way home. He was seated in his chariot and he was reading from the prophet Isaiah. So let's pause there for a minute because there's a big ellipsis with like a bunch of story. He's reading the prophet Isaiah. He has a scroll of Isaiah. He knows about the God of Israel, and he wants to worship the God of Israel. It's unlikely that he himself was an Israelite. It's unlikely that he himself was a part of the community of Israel because he lived in Ethiopia. It's possible, because there's a theory that Solomon, when he met the Queen of Sheba, that the Queen of Sheba brought the Israelite religion back to what is now Ethiopia, but it's a moot point. The point is, he was not an Israelite. And back in New Testament times, before the baptism of Cornelius, it was an argument that if you weren't Jewish, or you weren't not Jewish, if you weren't an Israelite, you were not allowed to then become Christian. So that was a big thing that Paul was arguing about, whether people needed to be circumcised before they could become Christian. So this person was reading about the God of the Israelites and wanted to worship the God of the Israelites, but probably got all the way there and wasn't able to worship, right? So Philip, who knows about Jesus, he's one of the apostles, Philip begins to speak, and starting with this scripture, he proclaimed to him the good news about Jesus. As they were going along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, here is water. What is to prevent me from being baptized?" He commanded the chariot to stop, and both of them, Philip and the eunuch, went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. So we've got this weird situation where this person, who is different from Philip, different in ethnicity and race, different in faith tradition, even though this person maybe worshiped the God of Israel, this person was not an Israelite. Different in terms of gender, this person is a eunuch and is not doesn't fit well within the community of Israel and the way they understood gender. And this person has an interesting structure too when it comes to enslavement and freedom, because we don't know if this person was a person who was enslaved under the Queen of Ethiopia or whether this person had their freedom or not. And there was an argument at this point too about whether slaves could become Christian without the explicit approval of the person who owned them. So there's a lot of things that will get in the way of this Ethiopian eunuch becoming part of the Christian community. Philip could have pointed to any of those things about this person's identity and said, here's why you can't be part of our group. But instead of Philip doing any of that, Philip just baptizes this person. Like, no requirements, no sinner's prayer, no any type of conversion, no go get permission from the Queen of Ethiopia, none of that. Philip just says, cool, let's do it. And that's the beginning of the Christian church. It starts with this Ethiopian person who lives outside of the understood boundaries of gender. So this is sort of a last quote for you. This is from Justin Sabiatanis, who wrote like one of the foundational texts on trans theology. He says, the fact that this person is a eunuch is not erased or marginalized in the story. He brings the particularity of his gender to his encounter with Philip and ultimately to his relationship with God. The power of this story lies in its specific description of inclusion. He is baptized not in spite of being a eunuch or after a lengthy session of apologetics explaining his gender to Philip, but simply at the point at which they pass a body of water. Bringing our whole selves just as we are is part of the integrity of our witness to God. In this story, we see that God does not ask us to put aside who we are in order to be part of the community of faith, but rather calls us as we are in our specificity. So the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch is sort of a foundational story in Christian history, and it's also a foundational story when it comes to gender inclusion. So I'm going to finish up with a couple of things here on why affirmation is important, why this work you're doing to become LGBT affirming and to become a reconciling in Christ community is important. One, it's important because gender expansive people are already part of our churches, right? We know this. We know this is not like they're out there and we're in here. There are between 1.6 and 2 million trans people in the US, and according to the 2015 trans survey, 66% had been involved in a faith community. So whether you're growing up in it or you find one later, they're already part of our communities. Second, not making a choice about inclusion is making a choice. According to HRC's 2012 report, Growing Up LGBT in America, a survey of more than 10,000 LGBT identified youth, ages 15 to 17, when asked about their faith community and whether it was accepting, 35% said no, 15% said yes, and 52% said they didn't know. Because of minority stress, trans and other LGBTQIA people assume that spaces are inherently unsafe unless we prove otherwise. We have a whole culture that tells people that Christians don't like LGBT people, right? That's what they're hearing all over the place. And unless we say something different, they will assume that we're not affirming. So that 52% that said they didn't know whether their church was affirming or not, that might as well be a no, because they have to assume that, right? So it's important when we make an explicit stand. And finally, it's important because when we talk about the church, I think a lot of people freak out about like the church is dying, right? Like the church isn't as big as it used to be and everybody's concerned about it. People, especially young adults, are leaving churches that don't become affirming. This is a thing that we know is happening. So there was a study in 2014 by the Public Religion Research Institute. It showed that 70% of millennials and 58% of Americans overall believe that religious groups are alienating people by rejecting LGBTQ individuals. 25% of respondents who were raised in a religious family but decided to leave the faith said that this was a factor in their decision. So if a quarter of people who are raised Christian are leaving because we're not taking a stand, that's an important thing to factor in when we talk about the size of our churches and how we bring people in, right? So why do we become affirming? We become affirming, one, because it creates safety and healing. This is I think, one of my favorite statistics out there. In 2018, they did a survey at the University of Texas, and they found that trans youth aged 15 to 21 who had their chosen name used at school, work, home, and with friends had a 34% decrease in reported thoughts of suicide and a 65% decrease in suicide attempts. Having even one context in which a chosen name could be used was associated with a 29% decrease in suicidal thoughts. So if we have these four categories, home, church, work, and with friends, right? What if church was a fifth category? What if we were the only place where we got people's name right for like the whole rest of their lives? Like, what if church was the one context in which we could make this difference for people? So church is not built into this study, but I would love to see another study that's like, what happens if your church, even if your school won't do it, even if people won't do it at home, even if have relatives who won't do it, what if church is the only place where we use your right name and pronouns? How does that affect people, right? Second, becoming affirming is actually great for the whole church. According to the 2009 report by the Institute of Welcoming Resources, churches that go through an official welcoming process show lower levels of conflict than churches that don't. Less than a third reported any significant conflict within the congregation within the last 2 years after becoming affirming. Now, why does this happen, I wonder? We think that it happens because once you go through one process of people figuring out how to disagree and still love each other, you can then do that with other issues, right? So they figure out, like, we had this big, difficult conversation. We did it once, we can do it again. And there ends up being less conflict overall. So it's actually really good for communal health. And finally, it's important to do it because we're called to work for justice and stand with the marginalized, right? As Christians, as people of faith, we are told that we are asked to act justly, to love mercy, and walk humbly with God, right? And to love our neighbor as ourselves. This is part of that work. Becoming affirming is part of that work. So that's where I'm going to leave us today. If you're looking for more resources on all of this, you're like, Austen, where did you get this information? I would definitely check out transmissionministry.com/resources. We have 3 resource pages, one for trans folks, one for family members, and one for ministry professionals. So whatever you're looking for, it's going to be at that resource list. And you can also contact me as well. So that's where I'm going to leave it for the presentation. I know that was probably a bit like drinking out of a fire hose. I wonder if anybody has any immediate questions before we finish up. Oh, how much is my book? $18. And I can take a card if you have tap card capability, or a check. Oh, yes. Good call. Right. So chosen names often for a lot of transgender and gender expansive people don't change their names because the name that they have is one that they already like and it's fine. But if you have an especially gendered name, like for instance, my birth name, I'm trans. I think I should have said that at the beginning. my birth name was a very feminine name. And so when I transitioned, I was like, that name doesn't really fit me anymore. And so I picked a different one. And lots of trans folks, the way you pick a name is very different. Some people pick a name because they feel really connected to a specific like virtue or word or character, even like something like that. I picked mine by asking my parents what they would have named me if I would have been assigned male at birth, and I kind of tweaked it a little bit. So I wanted my family to be involved in that for me, but not everybody is in that place. So yeah, people can pick different names, and it can sometimes take a little while to get the knack of using them, but it's really on the community to practice that with the person, to be brave enough to say like, I'm gonna probably screw this up a couple times, but I'm really gonna work on it with you. Yeah. Oh, hold on. Yeah, so right. So the word queer is a really interesting one because it's like an almost explicit generational divide. Folks that are older are like, do not say that word ever. It's a terrible word, right? Because it was used as a slur for so long. While young people are really gravitating towards it as a word that works for them in explaining their identity. The strength of the word queer is that it is super it can be as vague as you need it to be, which is, I think, why a lot of people like it. Some people who are trans use the word queer to describe themselves. They like it better. Queer can encompass sexual orientation, or it can encompass gender. It's very mutable, which is why people like it. It doesn't tell you exactly what I think a lot of people want to know when they're like, what label do you use, right? And so people like that sort of vagueness because it means that you have to actually get to know somebody to figure out what the word means to them. So I always say that the general rule for the word queer is, because it's got that history as a slur, right? If somebody uses it for themselves, then great, use it for them, but never use it for somebody without knowing if they use it for themselves, because that way you won't ever actually say something and somebody else is like, whoa, don't call me that, right? If they've called themselves that first, then you can use it. Right. So the word non-binary is another word that kind of comes up within trans spaces. So an example of this is I'm a trans guy, right? So I was assigned female at birth, but I know myself to be male. So I'm kind of a what sometimes people call a binary trans person, in that I went from sort of one box to another. So it can happen too if you're assigned male at birth and you know yourself to be a woman, right? It can kind of happen that way too. If you're non-binary, it means that neither of those two boxes work for you. Neither of those two boxes explain what your gender is. So to be non-binary just means not either of those two boxes. Some people understand being non-binary as kind of between the two, kind of like a spectrum. And other people are like, no, even the spectrum doesn't make sense. I'm not some of this and some of that. I'm something different. Sure, they, them are a common, exactly. It's a non-gendered pronoun. So they, them pronouns are very common for non-binary people because it's not either of those two boxes. So if your body includes gendered pieces that we would think of as both masculine and feminine, most of the time those people would identify as intersex or people with differences in sex development. They might be. I know, it's like, this sounds like we need to this sounds like we need to do a trans 101, which is a whole different lecture. Any other questions before we clear up? Okay, well, if you want to come ask me more questions, I'll hang out up here. Thank you so much for having me. It was great to be here. Yeah, thank you.